Dean Martin had learned long ago that fame did not make grief lighter. It only made it lonelier. By the time the phone rang in the quiet hours before dawn, he already knew that whatever waited on the other end would not be something he could sing away, joke through, or postpone with promises of soon. He lay still in the dark hotel room, the silence heavy. The world paused between night and morning, and when he finally lifted the receiver, he heard a voice that didn't sound like a star at all. It sounded like a boy who had lost the one person who had always made the world make sense. Elvis Presley did not cry when he spoke. That was what frightened Dean most. There were no sobs, no dramatic breaks, only a flat, hollow sound, as if grief had drained everything human from his chest and left behind a shell that could barely push air through. He said his mother was gone. He said her name once softly, like saying it too loudly might make it real. He did not ask Dean to come. He did not explain. He simply stopped speaking, and the silence between them did all the talking that words could not. Dean sat on the edge of the bed long after the call ended, staring at the wall as the first light of morning crept through the curtains. He thought of Gladys Presley not as a public figure's mother, but as a woman he had shared a table with, a woman who had laughed easily and worried constantly, who had watched her son move through the world with a mixture of pride and fear that never quite balanced. He remembered how she asked questions that weren't really questions at all, how she studied Elvis when she thought no one was looking, as if memorizing him in case something tried to take him away. Dean had seen that look before in his own mother's eyes, and it had always stayed with him as a quiet reminder that love carried its own kind of dread. Within an hour, Dean had canceled his commitments. He didn't explain much. He didn't need to. There were moments in life when the machinery of fame simply had to stop, when being present mattered more than being profitable. The flight from Los Angeles to Memphis passed in a blur of half-sleep and memory, his body exhausted but his mind restless, replaying conversations he wished he had finished, phone calls he had meant to return, visits he had delayed because there always seemed to be more time. By the time the plane touched down, guilt had settled into him like a second heartbeat, steady and unavoidable. The drive from the airport to the funeral home was quiet. The city felt subdued, as if it too understood that something sacred had been lost. Dean watched the streets pass by and thought about how strange it was that grief could turn even familiar places into foreign ground. He had performed in cities larger than this, louder than this, but nothing felt heavier than arriving somewhere not as a singer or a star, but as a man who had come too late to say goodbye. Outside the funeral home, the crowd was already gathering. Word traveled fast when tragedy touched someone the world felt it owned. Fans stood shoulder to shoulder with reporters, cameras held at the ready, eyes searching for a glimpse of the young man whose voice had filled their radios and whose smile had lit up movie screens. Dean moved through them quietly, his dark suit unremarkable, his sunglasses hiding eyes that had not slept, his posture closed in a way that discouraged conversation. When someone finally recognized him, he did not slow down. This was not a moment for acknowledgement or performance. This was a moment for presence. Inside, the air was thick with flowers and murmured condolences. Family members moved through the halls with the slow, careful steps of people afraid that one wrong movement might cause everything to collapse. Elvis's father stood near the entrance, shaking hands, thanking people, performing the role of stability because someone had to. When he saw Dean, relief crossed his face, brief but unmistakable. He did not say much, only nodded toward the room at the end of the hall, the door closed like a boundary no one knew how to cross. Dean approached that door without hurry, aware that whatever waited on the other side could not be rushed. He knocked once softly, then again. When Elvis's voice answered, thin and strained, telling him to go away, Dean did not argue. He opened the door anyway, not out of disrespect, but out of understanding. There were moments when grief needed to be challenged gently, when isolation became dangerous, when love meant refusing to leave. The room was dim, the curtains drawn tight against the outside world. Flowers surrounded the casket like a fragile barrier between life and death, and Elvis sat on the floor beside it, his back against the wall, his body folded inward as if trying to disappear. He looked smaller than Dean remembered, younger, stripped of the confidence that had once seemed unshakable. His clothes were rumpled, his hair uncombed, his hands trembling slightly as they rested in his lap. He did not look up when Dean entered, did not acknowledge him at all, and for a long moment, Dean wondered if he was even truly aware of anyone else in the room. Dean did not speak right away. He sat down on the floor beside Elvis, close enough to be felt but not so close as to intrude. He let the silence stretch, trusting it to do what words could not. He had learned through his own losses that grief often needed companionship more than conversation. Minutes passed. The room remained still except for the soft, uneven sound of Elvis breathing. When Elvis finally spoke, his words were heavy with blame, aimed inward with a cruelty that alarmed Dean. He said he had killed his mother not with his hands, but with his life, with the demands of fame, with the worry he believed he had placed on her heart. He spoke of choices he could not undo, of moments he wished he could relive, of a sense that success had come at a cost he had never agreed to pay. His voice did not rise. It did not crack. It simply emptied itself, one sentence at a time, as if confession might somehow make the pain manageable. Dean listened without interruption because he recognized the danger in what Elvis was doing. This was not mourning. This was self-destruction disguised as loyalty. When Dean finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, carrying the weight of experience rather than authority. He did not dismiss Elvis's feelings, but he challenged the story Elvis was telling himself, offering another truth alongside it. He spoke of illness as something indifferent to love and guilt, of loss as something that did not follow logic or fairness. He spoke, too, of his own mother, of the years he had spent believing he should have been able to save her, and of the slow realization that grief often tricked the living into punishing themselves because pain needed somewhere to land. Elvis did not respond right away. He stood and moved to the casket, resting his hand on his mother's, his shoulders shaking as the weight of memory pressed down on him. He spoke of poverty, of childhood, of being loved before there was anything impressive about him at all. He spoke of fear, of how success had changed the shape of their lives, of how he worried that the world had demanded too much from a woman who only wanted her son safe and close. Dean watched him carefully, understanding that beneath every word was the same question: how to live in a world where the person who made you feel anchored was suddenly gone. Dean joined him at the casket and spoke not as a star or an advisor, but as a witness. He described what he saw in Gladys Presley, not as a symbol or a story, but as a mother who had lived to see her child thrive, who had known pride and fear in equal measure, and who had loved deeply enough to let go. He did not pretend to offer certainty. He offered perspective, the idea that love could be complicated and still complete, that fear did not erase pride, that concern did not mean regret. When Elvis asked for a moment alone, Dean did not hesitate. He understood the need for private grief, for words spoken only to the dead. He moved toward the door, carrying with him the hope that something had shifted, even slightly. In the hallway, the quiet tension remained, questions unspoken, emotions held tightly in check. Dean did not know yet what the rest of the day would bring, or how deeply this loss would shape the young man he had come to care about. He only knew that showing up had mattered, and that sometimes being present at the worst moment of someone's life was the most important act of kindness a person could offer. The hours between morning and afternoon moved strangely, stretching and collapsing at the same time, as if grief had bent the rules of time inside the funeral home. Word spread quietly that Elvis had allowed a few people to enter the room in small intervals, not all at once, not for long. Each visit left him more exhausted, more hollowed out, and those who emerged carried the weight of having witnessed something intimate that did not belong to the public eye. Dean remained in the hallway for a long while after leaving the room, leaning against the wall, listening to the muted sounds of movement and murmured voices, wondering whether he had helped or simply opened a wound that could not be closed. When the service hour approached, the building filled to its limits. The chapel doors opened, and the crowd flowed in with the uneasy reverence of people aware they were stepping into history rather than simply attending a funeral. Dean took a seat toward the side, deliberately out of view, watching the room instead of the casket. He saw fans gripping handkerchiefs, older neighbors from Tupelo whispering to one another, men in dark suits standing stiffly as if posture alone could keep their emotions in check. And then Elvis entered, guided by his father and grandmother, his face pale, his movements careful, as though the ground beneath him might give way at any moment. There was a collective stillness when he sat down. The presence he carried was different now, stripped of performance, stripped of confidence. He was not the man who commanded stages or screens. He was simply a son placed front and center in his loss, unable to hide from it. Dean noticed how Elvis kept his hands clenched together, knuckles white, how his gaze rarely lifted from the floor. This was not someone seeking attention or sympathy. This was someone trying to survive the next minute. The service began quietly, scripture read in steady tones, hymns rising and falling through the room like waves that could not quite reach shore. Dean listened but did not fully hear the words. His attention kept drifting back to Elvis, to the way grief seemed to radiate from him, filling the space around him with something heavy and fragile at the same time. Dean had attended many funerals in his life, had stood beside many people who had lost someone they loved, but rarely had he seen grief so exposed, so unguarded, especially in someone so young and so public. When Dean was asked to speak, he hesitated only for a moment before standing. He had not prepared a speech. He had not rehearsed lines or structured a tribute. What he carried with him was memory and responsibility, and he trusted those more than polish. As he walked to the front of the chapel, he felt the weight of the room settle onto him, the unspoken expectation that he would say something meaningful enough to justify the attention of so many eyes. He took a breath and began, not by speaking of loss, but by speaking of love. He talked about Gladys Presley as a person rather than a symbol, as a woman whose devotion to her son shaped every choice she made. He spoke of dinners shared, of conversations where her pride surfaced quietly, never boastful, always protective. He described her worry not as weakness, but as evidence of deep care, the kind that never fully relaxes because it understands how much there is to lose. His voice remained steady, but there was no mistaking the emotion beneath it, the understanding that he was not just telling stories, but offering context to a room full of people struggling to make sense of what had happened. As Dean spoke, Elvis lifted his head, at first only slightly as if drawn by a familiar sound. Then more fully, his eyes fixed on Dean with an intensity that startled those nearby. It was the look of someone grasping for something solid in the middle of chaos, of someone hearing pieces of his own life reflected back to him in a way that did not accuse or diminish. Dean did not avoid his gaze. He met it, steady and unflinching, grounding the moment in shared recognition. When Dean finished, there was no immediate reaction. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with meaning. Then slowly applause rose, not loud or celebratory, but sustained and sincere, an acknowledgement not of performance, but of truth spoken gently. Dean returned to his seat without looking around, aware that the moment did not belong to him. It belonged to a mother whose life had ended too soon, and to a son whose life had been irrevocably changed. Burial that followed took place under a sky that felt too open, too indifferent. The cemetery was quiet except for the sound of footsteps on grass and the low murmur of prayers. Elvis stood at the graveside, his expression unreadable, his body rigid, as if holding himself together required constant effort. Dean watched from a respectful distance, understanding that this was a boundary he could not cross. This was family ground, sacred in a way that friendship could only approach, never enter. As the casket was lowered, Elvis's composure finally faltered. His shoulders shook, his breath came in uneven bursts, and for a moment it seemed as though he might collapse entirely. His father steadied him, and Elvis allowed it, leaning into that support with the vulnerability of someone who could no longer pretend to be strong. Dean felt a familiar ache in his chest, the recognition of a moment that would never loosen its grip, no matter how much time passed. When the crowd eventually dispersed, when the flowers were arranged and the last condolences offered, Elvis remained by the grave. Dean waited near his car, giving space but not leaving, understanding that sometimes the most important thing was simply not disappearing. When Elvis finally approached, his voice was quiet, almost matter-of-fact, as he spoke about obligations waiting for him, about the army, about doing what his mother would have expected of him even when every part of him wanted to stay rooted to that spot. Dean listened, nodding, offering neither reassurance nor resistance, only presence. He knew better than to promise that things would get easier quickly. Grief did not work that way. What he could offer was acknowledgement, the affirmation that honoring love sometimes meant enduring pain rather than escaping it. When Elvis thanked him, his gratitude carried more weight than words usually did, shaped by a day that had stripped away all pretense. That night, as Dean drove away from the cemetery, he felt the exhaustion finally catch up to him. But beneath it was something else, quieter and steadier, the knowledge that showing up had mattered. He did not know how the story would continue, how Elvis would carry this loss into the years ahead, or how fame would complicate the healing process. What he did know was that there were moments in life that asked nothing of you except your presence, and that answering those moments honestly could change the shape of someone else's future. In the days that followed the funeral, Memphis slowly returned to its routines. But for Elvis, time no longer moved in a way that made sense. Morning arrived whether he slept or not, meals were placed in front of him whether he ate or not, and people spoke to him as though language could still reach the place where he was living now. Grief had narrowed his world to a single aching point, and everything else existed only at its edges, distant and unreal. Dean had already returned to California, but the presence he left behind lingered, not as a voice in Elvis's head, but as a steady reminder that someone had seen him at his worst and had not turned away. Elvis moved through Graceland like a guest rather than its owner, pausing in rooms that still carried his mother's touch, her preferences, her habits, the small domestic decisions that defined a shared life. He noticed things he had never paid attention to before, the way she folded towels, the chair she favored near the window, the rhythm of her footsteps that he realized he could still hear if he closed his eyes long enough. Each discovery felt like both a gift and a wound, proof that she had been real and present, and proof that she was gone. At night, when the house fell quiet, the absence grew louder, filling the space she once occupied with questions that had no answers. The people around him tried to help in the ways they knew how. Some offered distraction, others encouragement, others reassurance that he was still needed, still admired, still important. Elvis heard all of it and absorbed none of it. Importance meant nothing when the one person who had anchored his sense of self was no longer there to see it. He thought often about the words Dean had spoken, not just at the casket, but later in quieter moments, about responsibility and choice, and living up to what someone believed you could be. Those words did not comfort him, but they did something else that mattered just as much. They kept him from turning entirely inward, from allowing grief to harden into something destructive. As the date of his departure for the army approached, Elvis felt torn between resentment and duty. Part of him wanted to reject the idea entirely, to refuse to leave the place where his mother rested, to cling to the last physical connection he had to her. Another part of him understood, in a way that felt almost painful in its clarity, that honoring her meant continuing forward, not retreating into sorrow. This tension played out quietly, without drama, in the small decisions he made each day, in the way he forced himself to eat, to speak, to acknowledge the world beyond his loss. Dean, for his part, carried the experience with him in subtler ways. Back in Los Angeles, he resumed his schedule, stepped back into the familiar rhythms of performance and public life, but something had shifted beneath the surface. He found himself less patient with trivial complaints, more attuned to the quiet signals of pain in the people around him. The image of Elvis at the graveside stayed with him, not as a spectacle, but as a reminder of how thin the line was between strength and collapse. Dean did not speak often about the funeral, and when he did, he kept the details spare, unwilling to turn a private moment into a story for consumption. When Elvis left for basic training, the separation felt final in a way that frightened him. Letters became his only bridge back to a life that now felt impossibly distant. He wrote to his father, to friends, and occasionally to Dean, his words careful and restrained, revealing just enough to acknowledge the weight he was carrying without surrendering to it completely. Dean responded in kind, offering encouragement without pressure, humor without dismissal, treating Elvis not as a fragile figure who needed protection, but as a young man capable of enduring something extraordinarily difficult. The structure of military life imposed a discipline that Elvis resisted at first, then slowly came to appreciate. The routines demanded his attention, his energy, his presence, leaving less room for the spiraling thoughts that had consumed him in the months after his mother's death. He still grieved, often and deeply, but the grief began to coexist with other experiences rather than overwhelming them entirely. There were moments, late at night, when the quiet of the barracks reminded him of Graceland's halls, and the ache returned with renewed force. In those moments, he remembered Dean's insistence that honoring love did not mean surrendering to loss, that continuing to live was not a betrayal. Over time, Elvis began to recognize subtle changes in himself. He listened differently when people spoke, noticed suffering more readily, felt a deeper connection to the songs that had once simply been vehicles for performance. Music, when he returned to it, carried a new gravity, shaped by an understanding of pain that could not be rehearsed or imitated. Dean noticed it too, when they eventually crossed paths again, the way Elvis carried himself with a quieter intensity, less eager to impress, more concerned with authenticity. Their friendship settled into something unspoken but enduring, defined not by constant contact but by mutual recognition. They did not need to revisit the funeral or dissect its meaning. What mattered was what followed, the way that one moment of presence had created a bond that survived distance, time, and the pressures of public life. Dean understood that he had not saved Elvis, and Elvis understood that he had not been rescued. What they shared was something simpler and rarer, the knowledge that in a moment of profound vulnerability, neither had been alone. As the years passed, the memory of Gladys Presley remained a guiding force in Elvis's life, sometimes as comfort, sometimes as challenge. He measured himself against what he believed she would have wanted, not always successfully, but sincerely. Dean watched from a distance, aware of the complexities that fame and expectation imposed, and held on to the quiet hope that the lesson of that day would continue to surface when it was most needed. Grief, neither man learned, ever truly ended. It changed shape, softened at the edges, made room for other emotions, but it did not disappear. What endured was the understanding that showing up mattered, that presence could alter the course of someone else's life in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. In the long silence after the crowd leaves, after the flowers fade and the headlines move on, what remains are the choices made in private, the commitments honored quietly, and the love that continues to exert its influence long after the loss that revealed it. Years have a way of softening the sharpest memories without erasing them, and for both Dean Martin and Elvis Presley, the passage of time did not remove the weight of that day in Memphis so much as redistribute it across their lives. The loss of Gladys Presley became less an open wound and more a constant presence, something carried quietly rather than confronted head-on. For Elvis, it shaped the way he understood love and responsibility, the way he measured success not by applause or numbers, but by whether he believed he was living in a way his mother would recognize. For Dean, it reinforced a belief he had long held but rarely articulated, that the most meaningful moments in a person's life often happened far from the stage, unnoticed by the world, sustained only by the willingness to be present when it mattered most. As Elvis returned fully to his career after the Army, the world greeted him with the same enthusiasm it always had, perhaps even more so. Crowds screamed, records sold, opportunities multiplied, and yet beneath the surface, something had changed. Those closest to him noticed it in small ways, in the seriousness with which he approached certain songs, in the moments of reflection that interrupted his otherwise relentless pace. He carried his mother with him not as a memory frozen in time, but as a standard against which he judged himself, sometimes harshly, sometimes gently. There were days when he felt he lived up to it, and days when he knew he did not, and both realizations pushed him forward in different ways. Dean observed these changes from a respectful distance, never assuming a role he had not been invited to occupy. He did not position himself as a guide or a guardian, understanding that Elvis's journey was ultimately his own. When they spoke, their conversations rarely returned to that day directly. Instead, they talked about work, about the strange pressures of public life, about the difficulty of knowing who you were when so many people insisted on telling you who you should be. Beneath these discussions lay an unspoken understanding, a shared acknowledgement of a moment that had revealed something essential about both of them. The story of the funeral occasionally resurfaced in interviews and conversations, often simplified or reshaped to fit a narrative the public found comforting. Some treated it as a dramatic turning point, others as an anecdote that reinforced familiar ideas about fame and tragedy. Dean rarely corrected these versions, not because they were accurate, but because the truth did not belong to anyone else. What mattered to him was not how the story was told, but what it had meant in the quiet space where it had actually occurred, away from cameras and commentary. For Elvis, the years brought both triumphs and struggles, moments of extraordinary connection and moments of profound isolation. The promise he had made, implicitly if not explicitly, to live in a way that honored his mother was not something he always fulfilled. He stumbled, sometimes badly, under the weight of expectation and the pressures that came with his position. Yet even in those moments, the influence of her love and the memory of that day remained present, surfacing in unexpected ways, in acts of generosity, in flashes of humility, in a persistent desire to give more than he took. Dean watched these developments with a mixture of admiration and concern, aware that no amount of talent or success could fully shield someone from the costs of their own intensity. He understood that showing up once did not guarantee a happy ending, that kindness did not solve everything, and that presence was not a cure. What it did offer was something quieter and more durable, a reminder that even in the most overwhelming moments, connection was possible, and that such connections could leave traces that endured long after circumstances changed. As both men grew older, the memory of Gladys Presley settled into a different place, no longer defined solely by loss, but by influence. Elvis spoke of her less frequently but with greater clarity, recognizing her role not just in his early life, but in shaping the values he continued to wrestle with. Dean carried his own reflections more privately, aware that his involvement in that chapter of Elvis's life had been brief but significant. He did not claim credit for any outcomes, positive or negative, understanding that the true impact of such moments could never be measured precisely. What endured most clearly was the lesson both men took from that experience, even if they articulated it differently. Life, they learned, was not defined only by achievements or failures, but by the willingness to step into another person's pain without trying to control it. Showing up did not require perfect words or solutions. It required attention, patience, and the courage to remain present when discomfort tempted retreat. In a world that rewarded performance and image, this kind of presence was rare and often overlooked, yet it carried a power that neither applause nor acclaim could replicate. In the end, the story of Dean Martin attending Gladys Presley's funeral was not about a celebrity gesture or a dramatic scene at a casket. It was about a moment of human recognition, about one person acknowledging another's grief without exploiting it, about a bond formed not through shared success, but through shared vulnerability. The impact of that moment did not unfold neatly or predictably, nor did it resolve all the challenges that followed. What it did was create a point of reference, a reminder that kindness offered at the right time could alter the course of someone's inner life, even if the outer story remained complicated. Long after the flowers had faded and the crowds had dispersed, long after headlines shifted and public attention moved on, that moment remained what it had always been, a quiet intersection of lives, marked by loss, empathy, and the simple act of showing up. In a world often distracted by spectacle, it stood as a testament to the enduring power of presence, and to the idea that even brief encounters, grounded in sincerity, could leave echoes that lasted a lifetime.